November 1927, Fifth Avenue, New York City. Snow blankets the corner of 57th Street as a wrecking crew assembles before dawn. Their target, the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan. 130 rooms, an entire city block. The former palace of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore who built America's railroad empire. The mansion had stood for 45 years, a French Renaissance chateau transplanted to American soil. Limestone walls carved with such detail that a single window surround required 6 months of labor. Interiors dripping with gold leaf and marble, imported from quarries that had supplied European royalty. The kind of house that announced wealth so loudly you could hear it from blocks away. Now it was coming down. Not because of fire, not because of structural failure, because nobody wanted it anymore, because the family couldn't afford the $30,000 annual tax bill, because the world that built such houses had ended. But here's what the newspapers didn't report, what the demolition crews didn't know as they swung their wrecking balls, what the public photographs never showed. This mansion was designed to fail. Not the architecture, the economics. Hidden in the original construction blueprints, preserved now in climate-controlled archives, lies evidence of a fundamental miscalculation. A monument built to last centuries couldn't survive a single generation. The math was never sustainable. The grandeur was always a trap. The Gilded Age began in the 1870s when industrial fortunes created a new class of American aristocrats. Railroad magnates, steel barons, oil monopolists, men who built palaces on Fifth Avenue to rival European royalty, who threw parties costing hundreds of thousands, who collected art, married their daughters to European nobles, and lived lives of opulence most Americans could barely imagine. By the 1920s, it was over. The mansions demolished for department stores and apartment buildings. The fortunes taxed. The social system that sustained it all collapsed under the weight of World War, progressive reform, and changing American values. This is not a story, this is an autopsy, and the evidence lies waiting in archives across America. Tax ledgers that expose the bleeding, blueprints that reveal the architectural pathology, payroll records that name the invisible hands who built empires they could never enter. A world built on inequality couldn't survive when the people at the bottom decided they'd had enough. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the economic forces that built and destroyed America's greatest estates, please like, subscribe, and consider joining as an exclusive member. Let's begin with the wrecking ball. The Vanderbilt mansion's demolition in 1927 was the end. But the trail of evidence begins much earlier, in dusty file boxes and forgotten archives, where the financial autopsy reveals exactly when the bleeding started. Chapter 1. The day Cornelius Vanderbilt's palace fell. In the climate-controlled archives of the New York Historical Society, a cardboard box labeled 665th Avenue Construction Records, 1880 to 1882, has sat largely untouched since its deposit in 1961. Inside, contractor invoices, material receipts, and architect correspondence that tell the story of how $3 million became a monument to economic miscalculation. The Vanderbilt mansion occupied the entire block between Fifth Avenue and Madison, 57th Street and 58th, 130 rooms spread across multiple floors. It was, by every measure, the largest private home ever constructed in New York City. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built it in 1882. Not the original Commodore Vanderbilt who made the fortune, but his grandson. By the time young Cornelius reached adulthood, the Vanderbilt name meant railroads, which meant money beyond calculation. The house reflected that wealth. Designed by George Brown Post, one of New York's leading architects, it cost over $3 million to construct, roughly $90 million in today's money. The exterior was French chateau style. Limestone walls, steep roofs, carved stone ornament covering every surface. It looked like something transplanted from the Loire Valley. Inside was even more elaborate. A grand hall rose 3 stories with carved oak paneling and stained glass windows. The ballroom could accommodate hundreds. A 2-story library held rare books. The dining room seated dozens beneath gilded ceilings. Every room competed to outdo the others in marble, gold leaf, exotic woods, and artistic detail. But the construction invoices reveal something the published photographs never showed. The real cost wasn't in the visible grandeur, it was in the invisible infrastructure. Below the marble floors, a coal-fired heating system required boiler rooms the size of small factories. The plumbing for 130 rooms demanded miles of copper pipe, custom-manufactured fittings, and a dedicated water tower on the roof. The electrical system, installed as a retrofit in the 1890s, required rewiring that cost more than many complete houses. The servants' quarters alone consumed an entire floor. Not because the staff lived luxuriously, but because maintaining this palace required an army. Cornelius II died in 1899 at age 55, reportedly from overwork managing the family railroad interests. His widow, Alice, continued living in the mansion. She maintained the house, the staff, the social obligations that came with being a Vanderbilt. The parties continued. The balls, the dinners. The mansion remained a center of New York society. But property tax assessments tell a story the family never wanted public. In 1882, the year of completion, the assessed value was $2 million. Annual property tax, $12,000. By 1900, reassessment pushed the value to $3.5 million. Tax bill, $21,000. By 1920, $4 million assessed. Tax, $30,000 annually. The house wasn't appreciating because it was getting more valuable. The city was simply catching up to what it had always cost to build such a monument. And taxes were just the beginning. Staff costs increased as servants demanded better wages. Heating bills climbed as coal prices rose. Maintenance never stopped. Limestone facades needed constant repair from weather and pollution. Slate roofs required replacement. Interior plasterwork cracked and needed skilled craftsmen to fix. Everything required constant expenditure. The war accelerated the changes. Servant shortages made it nearly impossible to maintain large staffs. Young men who would have been footmen and butlers were fighting in France. Young women who would have been maids found better-paying factory work. The social world that revolved around elaborate entertaining began to feel antiquated, even tasteless, when so many were dying overseas. Alice Vanderbilt lived in the mansion until 1926. By then, she was in her 80s. The house had become too large for one elderly woman, even with servants. The neighborhood was changing too. Commercial buildings were replacing other mansions. Fifth Avenue was becoming less residential, more business district. When Alice died, her heirs faced a decision: keep the house or sell it. The financial records are brutally clear. Property taxes alone, $30,000 annually. Add heating, electricity, basic maintenance, and minimal staff. The carrying costs exceeded $100,000 per year, roughly $3 million in today's money. Just to keep an empty building from deteriorating. To justify those expenses, someone would need to actually live there. To live there meant employing 30 to 50 servants. That meant another $100,000 or more in annual wages. Nobody in the family wanted the burden. The younger generation of Vanderbilts preferred smaller townhouses or apartments with modern conveniences. Central heating you could control with a thermostat. Elevators instead of staircases. Manageable spaces that didn't require a permanent staff. They had country estates for weekend retreats. They didn't need a city palace that ate money. The mansion went on the market. The price: $7 million for the land and building. No buyer emerged who wanted a private residence. The location was too valuable for that. This was prime commercial real estate in the heart of Manhattan. Bergdorf Goodman, the luxury department store, bought the property. They wanted the land. The building was irrelevant except as an obstacle to be removed. In 1927, the wrecking crews arrived. They started at the top, removing the slate roof tiles, then the upper floors, working their way down, salvaging materials where possible. The carved limestone facade, the marble mantels, the oak paneling. Some was saved and sold to collectors. Most went to landfill. New Yorkers watched the demolition with mixed feelings. Some mourned the loss of a landmark. Others saw it as inevitable progress. The mansion represented an era that felt increasingly distant. 45 years earlier, when it was built, America had no income tax, no labor regulations, no limits on how rich the wealthy could become. That world was gone. The demolition took months. Newspapers covered it regularly. Photographs showed the mansion gradually reduced to rubble. The chateau facade with gaping holes where windows had been, interior rooms exposed to the sky. The grand staircase leading nowhere. Finally, just an empty lot where one of America's greatest houses had stood. Bergdorf Goodman built a new store on the site. Art Deco style. Modern, clean lines, and large display windows. The new building announced a different set of values. Commerce over aristocracy. Modern efficiency over Gilded Age excess. Access for customers rather than exclusivity for the wealthy few. The Vanderbilt mansion wasn't the first to fall. By 1927, several other Fifth Avenue palaces had already been demolished. But it was the largest and most symbolic. When the biggest house built by one of America's richest families couldn't survive, it confirmed what many suspected. The Gilded Age was truly finished. The question is why? What forces destroyed a social and economic system that had seemed so permanent just decades earlier? The answer lies in archives 50 years deeper, in railroad receipts and steel contracts, in the formation documents of trusts and monopolies, in the records of fortunes built so fast that their owners believed the laws of economics no longer applied to them. To understand the end, we need to examine the beginning, how the Gilded Age started, what created the world where families like the Vanderbilts could build palaces while workers starved. The trail leads to the aftermath of America's bloodiest conflict and three men who would rewrite the rules of wealth itself. Chapter 2. The Railroad and Steel Kings of the 1870s. Railroad and corporation documents filed with New York State between 1865 and 1875 tell a story of consolidation that happened faster than regulators could comprehend. In the decade after the Civil War, over 200 small rail companies were absorbed into just 7 major systems. The speed was unprecedented. The wealth it generated was beyond anything America had seen. The Civil War ended in April 1865. 4 years of fighting had killed over 600,000 men. The South lay devastated. The North had won. But victory brought new questions. What kind of country would America become? The answer arrived on rails. Before the war, America had been a collection of regional economies. The Northeast manufactured goods. The South grew cotton. The West was mostly empty. Transportation between them was slow and expensive. Canals helped, but they froze in winter. Roads were terrible. Moving goods any distance took weeks or months. The war changed that. Both sides had used trains extensively for military purposes. The North especially had demonstrated how rail could move troops and supplies faster than anyone thought possible. Generals who understood logistics won battles. Logistics meant trains. After the war, that military knowledge became civilian opportunity. If trains could move armies, they could move anything: grain, cattle, steel, coal, people. The country just needed tracks connecting everywhere to everywhere else. In 1869, something extraordinary happened. 2 companies, building from opposite directions, met in Utah. The transcontinental line was complete. You could now travel from New York to San Francisco entirely by train. What had taken 6 months by wagon now took 6 days. The impact was immediate and enormous. Suddenly, the West wasn't isolated anymore. Farmers could ship wheat to eastern cities. Ranchers could send cattle to Chicago stockyards. Miners could move ore to smelters. Towns sprang up along railroads. Empty prairie became farmland. The country wasn't separate regions anymore. It was one integrated market. Building all those lines required enormous capital, more money than any individual could provide. So companies sold stock and bonds to investors. Those investors made fortunes when the ventures succeeded. And some individuals gained control of multiple rail companies, creating networks that spanned states. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, was the first to truly understand what rail consolidation meant. He'd started with steamships, making a fortune in shipping. In the 1860s, he moved into trains, not building new lines but buying existing ones and connecting them into a system. By the 1870s, Vanderbilt controlled the New York Central, which connected New York City to Chicago. He also controlled lines to Buffalo, to Albany, to dozens of other cities. His system moved freight and passengers more efficiently than smaller competitors. Efficiency meant profits. Profits made Vanderbilt one of the richest men in America. When he died, in 1877, his fortune was estimated at over $100 million. In today's money, that's well over $2 billion. The largest American fortune up to that point. He left most of it to one son, William, who proved even better at multiplying the family wealth. But trains were just one opportunity. The expanding rail network created demand for other industries. Track needed steel. Lots of it. Miles and miles of steel rail constantly wearing out and needing replacement. Andrew Carnegie saw that opportunity. A Scottish immigrant who started as a telegraph operator, Carnegie worked his way up in rail management. He learned how the business operated, what it needed, where the bottlenecks were. In the 1870s, he shifted from transportation to steel production. He built massive mills around Pittsburgh. Facilities that used the newest technology, the Bessemer process, which could produce steel faster and cheaper than old methods. Carnegie's mills ran efficiently, producing enormous quantities at lower cost than competitors. But Carnegie didn't just make steel. He controlled every step of the process. He bought iron ore mines in Minnesota. He bought coal mines in Pennsylvania. He bought ships to transport ore across the Great Lakes. He bought rail lines to move materials to his mills. This vertical integration meant he didn't depend on anyone else. Every dollar that could be extracted from the steel business stayed in the Carnegie system. By the 1880s, Carnegie Steel dominated American production. The company's profits were staggering. Carnegie himself was accumulating wealth that rivaled the Vanderbilts. Then there was oil, a new industry barely existing before the Civil War. In 1859, the first commercial oil well had been drilled in Pennsylvania. Initially, oil meant kerosene for lamps, a replacement for expensive whale oil. That market alone was substantial. John D. Rockefeller understood something others missed. The money wasn't in drilling for oil. Too risky. Wells came up dry or they produced too much and flooded the market, crashing prices. The money was in refining and distribution. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. The company bought crude from drillers, refined it into kerosene, and sold it to distributors. Rockefeller negotiated secret deals with rail companies for better shipping rates. He undercut competitors on price until they went bankrupt or sold out to him. He bought competing refineries, combining them into one massive operation. By 1882, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American refining. It was a monopoly in everything but name. Actually, it was a monopoly in name, too. Rockefeller organized his holdings as a trust, a legal structure that let him control multiple companies while technically keeping them separate. The trust made Rockefeller the richest man in America. Richer than Vanderbilt had been, richer than Carnegie. By some estimates, at his peak, Rockefeller's wealth was equivalent to over $400 billion in today's dollars, the richest American in history. These three men, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and others like them, created unprecedented concentrations of wealth. The speed was remarkable. Vanderbilt built his fortune in 2 decades, Carnegie in 1, Rockefeller even faster. They did it in an environment with almost no regulation. No income tax existed until 1913, no antitrust laws until 1890. No labor laws protecting workers, no requirements for workplace safety, no limits on working hours. Companies could do essentially whatever they wanted. Workers had no protections. If you got injured on the job, that was your problem. If you were fired, you had no recourse. If your wages were cut, you either accepted it or quit. Unemployment meant destitution. There was no safety net, no welfare, no unemployment insurance. You worked or you starved. This combination, massive industrial growth plus zero regulation, created fortunes faster than any previous era in history. But it also created inequality on a scale America had never seen. The ledgers don't lie. Census data from 1890 shows the top 1% owned more than the bottom 90% combined. The wealthy lived in palaces. The poor lived in tenements without plumbing or heat. The term robber baron was coined to describe these industrialists. Critics argued they'd stolen their fortunes through monopoly, corruption, and exploitation of workers. Defenders called them captains of industry, arguing they'd built the infrastructure that made America an economic power. Both descriptions held truth. These men had built rail networks, steel mills, and oil refineries that transformed the country. American industrial output soared. Cities grew. Living standards rose for many. But the benefits weren't equally distributed. Factory workers labored 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages barely covering rent and food. Child labor was common. Workplace accidents routine. Company towns trapped workers in systems where employers controlled housing, stores, and wages. The wealth gap wasn't just economic. It became architectural. These fortunes created a psychological need. When you accumulate money faster than you can count it, when you have more than your grandchildren could ever spend, wealth stops being about survival or even comfort. It becomes about something else. Permanence, legacy, proof that you've transcended the ordinary limits of human achievement. And the way you prove that is through stone. The question became, how do you translate industrial dominance into social legitimacy? How do you force old money families, who built their fortunes over generations, to accept men who made billions in a decade? The answer lay in New York's most exclusive social circle, governed by one woman whose approval meant everything, and whose rejection meant you didn't exist. Chapter 3. Mrs. Astor builds a world. Money alone didn't make you part of Gilded Age high society. The Vanderbilts learned that the hard way. When William Henry Vanderbilt, son of the Commodore, tried entering New York's elite circles in the 1870s, he found doors closed. His family had $100 million. They owned railroads. They wielded enormous economic power. None of it mattered. Old New York families considered the Vanderbilts nouveau riche. New money. Common. The Commodore had started as a ferryboat operator. That smell of work, of trade, of getting your hands dirty, never quite washed off. The Vanderbilts needed someone to legitimize them, someone who controlled access to the upper echelons, someone whose approval meant acceptance. That someone was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Mrs. Astor, as she was always called, came from old New York wealth. The Schermerhorns had been prosperous since colonial times. Land, trade, banking. The respectable kinds of fortunes that accumulated slowly over generations. When Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. in 1853, she joined another established family. The Astors had made their fortune in fur trading and Manhattan real estate. Old enough to be respectable, rich enough to be powerful. By the 1870s, Caroline had decided someone needed to define New York's elite. Too many new millionaires were appearing. Railroad money, oil money, steel money, all that new wealth threatened to overwhelm the old families. Without gatekeepers, anyone with money could claim position. She appointed herself gatekeeper, and she recruited help. Ward McAllister was a Southerner who'd made money in California and retired to New York with ambitions. He had refined tastes, European travel experience, and the time to devote to planning elaborate entertainments. He became Caroline's secretary, advisor, and enforcer. Together, they created structure, rules, a system that separated the acceptable from the unacceptable. First came the concept of the 400. McAllister supposedly coined the term in 1888, though Caroline had been operating on the principle for years. The idea was simple. New York's inner circle consisted of exactly 400 people, no more. That number supposedly reflected the capacity of her ballroom at 355th Avenue. The actual number was arbitrary. What mattered was exclusivity. By defining membership as a fixed number, Caroline and McAllister made inclusion valuable. If only 400 people counted, then being one of those 400 meant everything. How did one gain entry? Caroline decided. Period. There was no application process, no objective criteria. She simply determined who belonged and who didn't. Her approval granted access. Her disapproval meant permanent exclusion. Old money families were automatically included, the Livingstons, the Stuyvesants, the Rhinelanders, families who'd been wealthy since before the Revolution. That gave her a base of perhaps 50 to 75 families she considered legitimate. The remaining slots went to new money families who proved themselves acceptable. Proving yourself meant demonstrating proper behavior over extended periods. It meant having the right connections, the right marriages, the right taste, and most importantly, it meant Caroline liking you. The Vanderbilts, despite their wealth, struggled for years. The Commodore was too rough, too openly involved in business, too willing to publicly fight competitors. Caroline found him vulgar. His son William was more refined, but still associated with trade. Not until William's wife, Alva, forced the issue did the Vanderbilts gain entry. In 1883, Alva threw a costume ball so elaborate, so expensive, so magnificently excessive, that Caroline couldn't ignore it. The ball cost over $200,000, equivalent to over $6 million today. Guest lists preserved in the New York Historical Society archives show 1,200 attendees. Elaborate costumes, the house decorated top to bottom. It was a statement. The Vanderbilts had arrived. Whether Caroline liked it or not, she attended. Once she accepted the Vanderbilts, others followed. The family was finally legitimate. This system required constant maintenance. Caroline held regular receptions during the season, which ran from November through early spring. She hosted dinners. She attended the opera in her permanent box. She summered in Newport, Rhode Island, where she held court at her cottage, Beechwood. The season operated on strict schedules. Monday was opera night. Everyone who mattered attended the Metropolitan Opera. Not to hear music, but to be seen. Boxes were arranged by status. Caroline's box was center first tier, the best location. From there, she could survey the entire house, noting who attended and with whom. Calling cards were essential. Ladies left cards when visiting. Not being home meant leaving your card in a silver tray the butler held. The cards themselves conveyed messages. A turned-down corner meant you'd called in person rather than having your footman leave it. Different days were designated for receiving calls. Tuesday might be Caroline's at-home day. Calling on Tuesday meant she'd receive you. Calling on Wednesday meant she wouldn't. young women made their debut during carefully orchestrated balls. Debutante presentations introduced daughters to the upper crust, marking them as eligible for marriage. The most important events happened at Caroline's balls. Being invited meant your family had arrived. Not being invited meant you didn't exist. Men had slightly different rules. Business success alone wasn't enough. You needed the right club memberships. The Union Club, the Metropolitan Club, the Knickerbocker Club. These clubs provided spaces where wealthy men gathered, made deals, and reinforced bonds. Membership required sponsorship from existing members. One black ball could exclude you permanently. The whole system was designed to prevent mobility. Caroline and her circle wanted to preserve their position at the top. By creating elaborate rules and rituals, by making acceptance require her personal approval, she ensured that new money couldn't simply buy their way in. They had to be granted entry. But the system had vulnerabilities. It required that new money care about acceptance. The first generation of robber barons often didn't. The Commodore Vanderbilt reportedly didn't care what Caroline thought. He had money and power. That was enough. The second generation cared more. William Vanderbilt, and especially his wife Alva, wanted acceptance. Their children would marry into the established families. Position mattered for business connections, for marriage prospects, for how the family was perceived. The third generation cared most of all. By the 1890s and 1900s, young Vanderbilts, Astors, and other wealthy heirs grew up assuming they belonged at the top. They'd never known anything else. The structure seemed natural and permanent. Caroline maintained her position until her death in 1907. By then she was elderly, increasingly confused, but still acknowledged as the arbiter of taste. After her death, others tried claiming her role. None succeeded completely. The world fragmented. Multiple women claimed authority. The rules became less rigid. But during her peak years, roughly 1875 to 1900, she wielded power that money alone couldn't buy. She decided who mattered. And the wealthy families, building mansions on Fifth Avenue, all sought her approval. Those mansions were statements, declarations of wealth and taste, attempts to prove worthiness. And Fifth Avenue became the stage where those declarations played out. But here's what the social registers don't record, what the guest lists and calling cards don't reveal. The architectural race wasn't just about impressing Caroline Astor. It was about something deeper. A psychological compulsion that turned competition into pathology. When acceptance required not just money but the right kind of display, when your home became the physical manifestation of your worthiness, architecture stopped being about shelter. It became diagnosis. Within 2 decades, Fifth Avenue above 50th Street would transform from quiet residential blocks into the most expensive real estate in America. Block after block of limestone palaces, each one larger and more elaborate than the last. And hidden in the original blueprints of these monuments lie architectural anomalies that reveal the true cost of this competition. Chapter 4. Fifth Avenue becomes Gold Coast. The original architectural drawings for 665th Avenue, preserved at Columbia University's Avery Architectural Library, show something the published photographs never revealed. Beneath the limestone facades and gilded ballrooms lay a parallel world. A hidden infrastructure so complex, so expensive to operate, that it guaranteed these palaces could never survive as private residences. In 1870, Fifth Avenue above 50th Street was mostly empty. A few brownstones. Some vacant lots. Trees. Quiet, almost suburban. The fashionable residential district sat further downtown around Washington Square and Lower Fifth Avenue. 20 years later, everything had changed. The stretch from 50th Street to 90th had become the most expensive residential real estate in America. Block after block of limestone mansions. French chateaux. Italian Renaissance palaces. Beaux-Arts extravaganzas. each one larger and more elaborate than the next. This was Vanderbilt Row. Carnegie Hill, Millionaire's Mile, the physical manifestation of Gilded Age wealth, and it rose with remarkable speed. The transformation began with the Vanderbilts. William Henry Vanderbilt, son of the Commodore, started it in 1879. He commissioned a massive brownstone at 5th Avenue and 51st Street. Not satisfied with one house, he built 3 connected residences, one for himself and his wife, one for each of his 2 daughters. The entire complex cost nearly $2 million. But brownstone already felt outdated. The really fashionable material was limestone, white, elegant, more European. And the fashionable style was French, specifically the Chateaux of the Loire Valley. Never mind that French nobility built those chateaux over centuries. American millionaires wanted them now, built in 2 years. Richard Morris Hunt became the architect of choice. He'd studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so. He understood French architecture intimately. More importantly, he understood his clients. They wanted grandeur. They wanted to impress. They wanted houses that announced wealth from blocks away. Hunt delivered. In 1883, he designed a mansion for William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva. The house rose on 5th Avenue at 52nd Street, right across from William Henry Vanderbilt's brownstones. It was French Gothic, gray limestone, steep roofs, carved ornament everywhere. Inside were medieval tapestries, stained glass, carved wood paneling imported from European estates. The house cost $3 million. Another $2 million went to furnishing and decorating it. But the construction blueprints tell a different story than the society pages. Hunt's original drawings, dated March 1881, show the visible mansion occupying roughly 40% of the total floor plan. The remaining 60% consists of service infrastructure invisible to guests. Corridor D7, a passage running the length of the 3rd floor. On the presentation drawings shown to the Vanderbilts, it's labeled Service Hall. But the construction blueprints reveal something else. The corridor leads nowhere. It terminates in solid masonry. No door, no window, no purpose. This wasn't a drafting error. The masons' notes confirm they built it exactly as specified. Why construct a hallway to nowhere? The answer lies in the servant hierarchy. Upper housemaids needed separate circulation from lower housemaids. Footmen couldn't use the same passages as kitchen staff. Each rank required its own route through the house. The result: corridors built for segregation that served no functional purpose beyond maintaining invisible social distinctions even among servants. The Vanderbilt mansion contained 17 such anomalous spaces. Staircases that climbed to blank walls. Storage rooms accessed only by crawling through adjoining closets. A sub-basement level not connected to any other floor, reachable only through an exterior coal chute. These weren't design errors, they were symptoms. When you build a palace to display dominance, every choice becomes about control. Control over who sees what. Control over who goes where. Control over every sightline, every circulation path, every interaction. The architecture becomes a physical manifestation of psychological need, and the cost was staggering. Below the marble floors, boiler rooms the size of small factories. The heating system for the Vanderbilt mansion required 6 coal-fired boilers operating continuously from October through May. Coal consumption, 12 tons per week at peak winter. Annual cost, roughly $35,000. In today's money, over $1 million per year just for heat. The plumbing system demanded 60 miles of copper pipe. Custom manufactured fittings. A dedicated water tower on the roof holding 15,000 gallons. When the electric system was retrofitted in 1895, rewiring cost more than most complete houses. And every one of these systems required specialized servants to maintain them. The staffing infrastructure consumed an entire floor, not because servants lived luxuriously, but because maintaining this palace required an army. Chief engineer, 2 assistant engineers, coal stokers, plumbers, electricians. That's just for the mechanical systems. Add butler, housekeeper, cook, multiple footmen, multiple maids, kitchen staff, chauffeurs, grooms. The minimum permanent staff, 42 people. Vanderbilt chateaus set the pattern. Suddenly, every millionaire wanted a French palace or an Italian Renaissance villa or a Beaux-Arts hotel particulier. Anything European. Anything that suggested centuries of aristocratic breeding, even if the fortune was less than a decade old. The architectural competition escalated quickly. If the Vanderbilts built at 52nd Street, the Astors would build bigger at 65th. If Carnegie commissioned a house at 91st, someone else would go even further uptown. Each mansion tried to outdo its neighbors. Andrew Carnegie built his palace between 90th and 91st Streets in 1899. He'd studied the other mansions carefully and decided they were all too ostentatious. His would be simpler, elegant, refined. It still cost over $1 million and occupied an entire block front. Simple was relative. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's business partner and later rival, built further downtown at 70th Street. His mansion was designed to eventually become a museum. Frick was already collecting old master paintings. He wanted a house that displayed them properly. Classical architecture. Large galleries. Perfect lighting. The house opened in 1914 just as the era was ending. The Astors built multiple houses. Caroline Astor's residence at 355th Avenue was relatively modest compared to later palaces. Her son built larger. Her nephews built larger still. The family owned property up and down Fifth Avenue. Astor money made in Manhattan real estate bought Manhattan real estate, which increased in value, generating more money to buy more property. Senator William Andrews Clark, who'd made a fortune in Montana copper mining, built perhaps the most excessive mansion of all. 121 rooms, 4 art galleries, multiple ballrooms. It cost $7 million and took 7 years to complete, finishing in 1911. Critics called it vulgar. Clark didn't care. He had money and wanted everyone to know it. The construction boom created opportunities for architects, contractors, decorators, and craftsmen. European firms exported marble by the shipload. Italian artisans came to carve stone details. French decorators installed paneling and furniture. The mansions became showcases for imported luxury. Building one of these palaces wasn't quick. 2 to 4 years was typical. During construction, neighbors had to endure constant noise. Stone cutting, hammering, wagons delivering materials. The disruption was immense, but nobody complained too loudly. Everyone on Fifth Avenue was either building or planning to build. The houses competed in details. Whose ballroom was largest? Whose marble staircase was most impressive? Whose art collection was most valuable? The wealthy owners treated their residences like museums, giving tours to favored visitors, showing off acquisitions. And the staffing requirements were staggering. A house with 30 to 50 rooms needed 20 to 40 servants minimum. Butler, housekeeper, cook, multiple footmen, multiple maids, kitchen staff, chauffeurs for the automobiles, grooms for the horses, groundskeepers for any gardens. The servants lived in top floors usually, narrow rooms, plain furnishings, totally separate from the lavish spaces below. Servants used separate staircases. They weren't supposed to be seen unless actively serving. The system required constant management. The housekeeper supervised female staff. The butler supervised male staff. Everyone answered to the lady of the house, who oversaw the entire operation. The costs extended beyond construction and staffing. Property taxes climbed as the city assessed these palaces at their true value. Insurance was expensive. Heating costs in winter were enormous. These houses had dozens of fireplaces, plus early central heating systems that burned coal by the ton. Maintenance was constant. Roofs leaked. Masonry cracked. Interior decoration required updating every few years to stay fashionable. But for 2 decades, roughly 1885 to 1905, the building continued. More mansions, larger mansions, more elaborate mansions. Fifth Avenue became a canyon of wealth. Walking up the avenue meant passing palace after palace, each announcing its owner's fortune. The concentration of wealth in such a small area was unprecedented. Within 20 blocks lived families worth hundreds of millions collectively. They attended the same parties. Their children married each other. They sat on the same corporate boards. They shaped American business and finance from their Fifth Avenue drawing rooms. The street became a tourist attraction. People would walk or take trolleys up Fifth Avenue just to gawk at the mansions. On Sunday afternoons, the sidewalks filled with middle-class families staring at houses they could never afford. The wealthy residents ignored them or resented the intrusion, but couldn't stop it. These were private homes on public streets. And the whole display depended on a system that seemed permanent. The wealthy would stay wealthy. Their children would inherit and maintain these houses. The mansions would stand for generations like European palaces. Nobody building these houses in the 1890s imagined that within 30 years most would be demolished. Nobody thought the system could collapse. But forces were already building that would destroy everything they'd created. And those forces were gathering in places the Fifth Avenue residents rarely saw. In factories, in tenements, in newspapers, in political movements. The backlash against Gilded Age excess was coming. It just hadn't arrived yet. But before the backlash, before the collapse, there was one final performance. The ultimate display of wealth that would both cement social position and accelerate financial ruin. Inside the gilded ballrooms, behind the imported tapestries, a different kind of evidence was accumulating. Evidence that would reveal how these families turned luxury into a liquidity strategy that most historians completely miss. Chapter 5. Inside a Gilded Age Ball. The invitation arrived weeks in advance. Heavy cardstock. Engraved lettering. Your name written in elegant script. The date. The time. The address. And implicitly, the expectation that you would attend. Refusing a major ball invitation without excellent reason was unthinkable. These events weren't just parties. They were where reputations were made or destroyed, where marriages were arranged, where business alliances formed, where the social hierarchy was displayed and reinforced. Preparing for a ball took days. For women especially, every detail mattered. The gown had to be new, or at least not worn to any recent event these same people had attended. It had to be fashionable, but not too daring, expensive, but not ostentatious. The dress alone might cost several $1,000s, equivalent to a year's wages for a factory worker. Then there were jewels. Diamonds were essential. Emeralds, rubies, sapphires. The wealthiest women wore fortunes around their necks, tiaras, necklaces, bracelets, rings. But auction house records from Christie's and Sotheby's, preserved in their corporate archives, reveal something the society pages never reported. The jewelry wasn't just display. Between 1893 and 1907, over 40 prominent Gilded Age families quietly sold significant portions of their gem collections. The Panic of 1893 triggered the first wave. Railroad stocks collapsed. Banks failed. Fortunes that seemed permanent evaporated in weeks. Estate liquidation documents filed in New York Surrogate's Court reveal the pattern. When William Backhouse Astor Jr. died in 1892, his will valued his wife's jewelry collection at $350,000, roughly $12 million today. By 1896, court records show she'd sold $200,000 worth. The proceeds went to cover property taxes and household expenses her husband's estate couldn't immediately liquidate. She wasn't alone. The jewelry served dual purposes. Display of wealth, obviously, but also a kind of portable bank account. If financial disaster struck, jewels could be sold. Many families weathered temporary reversals by quietly liquidating gems. This was financial strategy disguised as ostentation. A diamond necklace worth $50,000 was equivalent to 5 years of property taxes on a Fifth Avenue mansion. It was portable. It could be sold discreetly in Europe. It didn't appear on property assessment rolls or income tax returns. The wealthiest women wore their insurance policies, and they needed them. The Gilded Age fortunes were less stable than they appeared. Railroad investments required constant capital. Steel mills faced competition. Oil monopolies attracted legal challenges. Liquid cash was often scarce even for families worth millions. So they converted wealth into wearable assets. Diamonds that could be pawned in Paris. Rubies that could be sold in London. Emeralds that auction houses would accept with no questions about the seller's financial distress. The ball itself was theater. Hair required hours of attention. Ladies, maids worked with curling irons heated over gas flames. They arranged elaborate styles, pinned in jeweled combs, added false hairpieces if necessary. The goal was height and volume. Hair piled high made women appear taller, more regal. Men had it easier. Evening dress was standardized. Black tailcoat, white waistcoat, white bow tie, white gloves. Patent leather shoes. The uniformity was intentional. Men weren't supposed to compete in dress. Their wealth showed through their wives' and daughters' appearance. Carriages began arriving around 9 or 10 in the evening. Earlier arrivals risked appearing too eager. Later arrivals risked missing important moments. The timing required careful calculation. The approach to a major mansion on ball night was spectacular. Awnings stretched from the curb to the entrance. Red carpet covered the sidewalk. Liveried footmen stood at attention. Police kept back curious onlookers who gathered to watch the wealthy arrive. Inside, the transformation was complete. Servants had spent days preparing. Every room on the ground floor opened for the event. Furniture was removed or pushed against walls. Thousands of flowers filled every space. Roses, orchids, lilies, palms in huge urns. The flowers alone might cost $10,000, gone and wilted by morning. Lighting was crucial. Gas lights or early electric lights blazed. Candles and candelabras added warmth. The goal was brilliant illumination. These events happened at night, but should feel like daylight. Bright enough to see everyone clearly. Bright enough that jewels sparkled. Bright enough that no shadows offered escape from scrutiny. The host and hostess received guests in the main hall or drawing room. Guests passed through a receiving line. Handshakes. Brief greetings. Names announced by the butler. This moment established who was invited, who attended, who belonged. Being in that line meant acceptance. Music played from the moment guests arrived. A full orchestra, typically positioned in a gallery or on a landing where they could be heard but not seen. Waltzes, mazurkas, polkas. Later in the evening, the new daring dances from Europe. The turkey trot, the bunny hug. Older attendees disapproved, but younger people insisted. Dancing began formally. Older married couples first. Then younger married people. Finally, unmarried young women with appropriate partners. The order mattered. Dancing out of sequence suggested disrespect for convention. Young women came to balls to be seen by potential husbands. Their mothers watched carefully, noting which men asked their daughters to dance. Too many dances with one man suggested improper attachment. Too few dances total suggested unpopularity. The ideal was steady attention from multiple appropriate suitors. Men used balls to evaluate marriage prospects. Dancing provided opportunity for conversation. You could assess intelligence, personality, interests. You could judge how a woman carried herself, how she interacted with others. And of course, you could evaluate her family's wealth and connections. Between dances, guests circulated. They visited different rooms, admired the art and furnishings, gossiped, made observations. Every conversation was calculated. Whom you spoke with mattered. Being seen in earnest discussion with important people suggested you were important too. Around midnight, supper was served. Not a seated dinner, a buffet in the dining room and adjacent spaces. Tables laden with food, hot dishes, cold dishes, elaborate arrangements designed to impress. Whole pheasants, salmon, lobster, oysters, caviar, champagne flowing constantly. The food alone might cost $20,000, roughly $700,000 in today's money. Guests ate standing or seated in small groups. The informality was intentional. It encouraged mixing. People could move between groups, start conversations, make connections. This was when business was actually discussed, when parents arranged meetings between their children, when alliances formed. Supper lasted an hour or more. Then, dancing resumed. The pace increased. The rules relaxed, slightly. As the night wore on and champagne took effect, the atmosphere loosened. Not scandalously, never scandalously, but enough that laughter came easier. Conversation flowed faster. The ball didn't end at a specific time. Guests departed when ready. The host and hostess remained until the last guest left, which might be 3 or 4 in the morning. Servants stayed later still, cleaning, clearing dishes, removing flowers, resetting furniture. They might work until dawn. The next day, newspapers covered major balls. Society pages listed attendees, described gowns, noted who danced with whom. These accounts were read eagerly. Being mentioned meant you mattered. Being ignored meant you didn't. The costs of throwing such an event were staggering. A major ball easily cost $50,000 to $100,000. Flowers, food, servants, music, decorations. That's equivalent to $2 to $4 million today, for one evening. One night of entertainment that would be forgotten within a week. But these events weren't really about entertainment. They were displays of power, demonstrations of wealth, opportunities to reinforce the social hierarchy. Every element, the invitations, the flowers, the food, the music, served to show that the host could afford it, and the guests deserved to be there. And the frequency was remarkable. During the season, a major ball happened nearly every week. Multiple smaller events happened constantly. Dinners, receptions, theater parties, opera nights. The wealthy class spent months every year doing essentially nothing but entertaining each other. This lifestyle required enormous resources, time, money, staff, energy, and it required that you never questioned whether it was worthwhile. The system worked as long as everyone agreed it mattered. Once people started questioning whether elaborate balls served any purpose, the whole structure became vulnerable. By the early 1900s, some voices were already questioning. Progressive reformers pointed out the disparity, One ball cost more than a factory worker earned in a lifetime. The same families throwing $100,000 parties employed workers at poverty wages. The criticism stung. Some wealthy hosts became defensive. Others became more discreet. A few began to question their own lifestyle. But mostly the balls continued, because stopping meant admitting the critics were right. And the Gilded Age elite weren't ready for that admission. Not yet. But behind every ball, behind every elegant dinner, behind every perfectly maintained residence, stood an army of workers laboring constantly. And preserved in employment ledgers and immigration records are names the society pages never printed. Names of craftsmen whose hands built monuments they could never enter. It's time to read those names aloud. Chapter 6. The Servant Army Below Stairs. Employment ledgers preserved at the New York Municipal Archives tell a different story than the society pages. While newspapers listed the guests who attended balls, the ledgers list the people who made those balls possible. Their names, their wages, their origins, their invisible labor. A Gilded Age mansion didn't run itself. Behind every elegant ball, every formal dinner, every perfectly maintained residence, stood an army of workers laboring constantly. The numbers were staggering. A typical Fifth Avenue palace required 30 to 50 staff members. Larger establishments employed 70 or more. The Vanderbilt cottage in Newport, a 70-room summer house, kept a permanent crew of 40, and that didn't count temporary hires for special events. The hierarchy below stairs was as rigid as the one above. At the top sat the butler. He supervised all male employees, managed the wine cellar, oversaw formal service, and acted as the master's personal attendant. A good butler earned $1,200 to $2,000 annually, roughly $40,000 to $65,000 in today's money. Substantial pay for the era, reflecting the position's importance. The housekeeper ranked equally high, but supervised the female staff. She managed linens, oversaw cleaning, handled household accounts, and ensured everything ran smoothly. Her salary matched the butler's. Together they formed the management layer that kept the household operating. Below them came specialized positions. The cook ran the kitchen like a military operation. She might have 2 or 3 assistants plus scullery maids. In wealthy households, the cook was often French, hired specifically because French cuisine carried prestige. These professionals commanded high salaries and temperamental reputations. Ladies' maids served the mistress and adult daughters. They dressed hair, maintained wardrobes, packed for travel, provided personal service. This was skilled work requiring training. A lady's maid needed to know current fashions, understand fabrics, style hair elaborately, and maintain discretion about family matters. Valets performed similar duties for the master and adult sons. They maintained wardrobes, laid out clothes, drew baths, shaved their employers if required. The position required knowledge of men's fashion and complete reliability. Footmen were young men in livery who served at table, answered doors, and provided general assistance. They were chosen partly for appearance. Height mattered, good looks helped. They wore elaborate uniforms designed to impress visitors. Their work was visible, making them part of the display. Maids divided into categories. Parlor maids cleaned public rooms, maintaining the showpiece spaces guests saw. Bedroom maids handled private chambers. Kitchen maids worked under the cook. Laundry maids, often multiple women, tackled mountains of washing and ironing. Each category had its own duties and status. Below everyone came the scullery workers. They scrubbed pots, cleaned floors, performed the dirtiest tasks nobody else would touch, usually young girls, often recent immigrants. They earned perhaps $3 weekly, Roughly $100 in today's money? They slept in tiny attic rooms, worked 16-hour days, and dreamed of advancing to better positions. But these employment records also preserve names of a different category: the craftsmen who built the mansions before the servants arrived to staff them. Immigration manifests from Ellis Island, cross-referenced with household payroll records and architectural firm ledgers, reveal the specialists imported specifically for Fifth Avenue construction. For the Vanderbilt mansion at 665th Avenue, stone carvers came from Carrara, Italy. The same marble quarries that supplied Michelangelo. The manifests list them: Giovanni Rossini, master stoneworker; Giuseppe Bellini, architectural sculptor; Marco Marchetti, ornamental carver. They arrived in New York in May 1881, contracted for 18 months, paid $6 per day. Exceptional wages for the time, roughly $190 in today's money. But the work was specialized. Carving elaborate limestone ornament required years of training. These men shaped the facade details that made Fifth Avenue mansions look like European chateaux. The woodwork, the carved oak paneling, the elaborate staircases, the coffered ceilings came from Swiss craftsmen, master carpenters trained in Alpine traditions of detailed wood sculpture. For the Vanderbilt Library ceiling alone, 6 Swiss woodcarvers worked for 14 months. The manifests name them François Duclos, Henri Mélin, Jakob Zürcher, and 3 assistants whose names are listed only as Müller. They carved ebony imported from Ceylon into geometric patterns so intricate that each square foot required 40 hours of labor. The ceiling spans 800 square feet. That's 32,000 hours of handwork. At $6 per day for 14 months, the labor cost exceeded $25,000. Just for one ceiling, not including the ebony itself, which cost another $18,000. These craftsmen didn't live in the mansions after completion. They returned to Europe or moved to other projects. Their signatures appear not in guest books but in architectural specifications and customs records. The permanent staff faced different circumstances. The labor was relentless. A housemaid's day began around 6 in the morning. Light fires in fireplaces throughout the house. Empty chamber pots. Bring hot water for washing. Prepare breakfast. Serve breakfast. Clear breakfast. Clean public rooms before the family woke and wandered downstairs. All while remaining invisible. Domestics were trained to fade into the background. If the family encountered you, you'd failed. After morning duties came lunch preparation and service. Then afternoon tasks. Then dinner preparation. Formal dinners required elaborate service, multiple courses, proper timing, coordinated serving. The butler orchestrated everything like a conductor. One mistake, one spilled drop, one moment of clumsiness could result in dismissal. After dinner came cleaning, washing dishes by hand, scrubbing pots, putting away silver, cleaning the dining room, preparing for the next day. Kitchen staff might labor until 11 at night or later, then up again at 6 the next morning. 1 day off monthly was standard. Some employers allowed less. That day off usually meant Sunday afternoon and evening. Not enough time to go far or do much. Just enough to attend church, write letters home, and rest before returning to duty. Living conditions varied. The best employers provided decent rooms, adequate food, and treated their people with respect. Others crammed domestics into unheated attics, fed them scraps, worked them mercilessly. Employees had no recourse. Employment was at will. You could be fired instantly without explanation or references. No job meant no income. No income meant potential homelessness. The work was also dangerous. Kitchens were hot. Fires burned constantly. Heavy pots caused burns. Knives cut. Laundries used harsh chemicals. Falls from ladders while cleaning upper windows killed or injured people regularly. No workers, compensation existed. If you got hurt, you were dismissed and replaced. The wages seemed pitiful by modern standards, but made sense in context. Board and room were included. Domestics didn't pay rent, buy food, or purchase work clothes. Their wages represented money that could be saved or sent to family. Many immigrant workers supported relatives back in Europe on their earnings. Still, the inequality was stark. A lady's maid earning $400 annually dressed a woman who spent more than that on a single ball gown. Footmen earning $300 yearly served dinners where the wine alone cost more than they made monthly. The disparity was visible daily, impossible to ignore. Some employers treated staff well. They provided gifts at Christmas, bonuses for long service, medical care when people fell ill. These gestures created loyalty. Workers who felt appreciated stayed for decades, becoming part of the family in a limited way. Other employers were cruel. They docked wages for minor infractions. They prohibited followers, meaning household staff, couldn't have romantic relationships. They dismissed pregnant maids without references, ensuring they'd never find positions in respectable homes again. The power imbalance was total. Young women faced particular dangers. Unwanted advances from men of the house or their guests were common. Refusing could mean dismissal. Accepting could mean pregnancy and ruin. Some employers blamed the maids regardless, maintaining that domestics must have been seductive. Victims had no protection, no advocates, no justice. Labor organizing among household workers was nearly impossible. They lived with their employers. They worked individually, not in groups. They were easily replaced. Unions focused on factory employees and miners, people who labored collectively. Domestic workers remained isolated and vulnerable. By the early 1900s, the supply of household help was declining. Young women found other options. Factory work paid less but offered more freedom. You could leave at the end of your shift, live independently, have privacy. Even with lower wages, many preferred factory work to domestic service. The wealthy families noticed. Finding good help became difficult. Training new people constantly was exhausting. Wages had to increase to attract labor. The economics of maintaining huge staffs grew challenging. World War I accelerated the change. Young men went to war. Young women took factory jobs, supporting the war effort. Domestic service came to seem old-fashioned, servile, a relic of aristocratic Europe, not modern America. The shortage made maintaining the mansions harder. Running a 50-room house with half the staff it needed was impossible. Corners got cut. Standards declined, and the costs kept rising even as service quality fell. This created pressure on the whole system. The mansions required people to function. Without adequate help, they became burdens rather than showpieces. The wealthy families who'd built these palaces, assuming labor would always be available, found themselves trapped in houses they couldn't properly maintain. And the workers themselves, who'd made the whole Gilded Age lifestyle possible, were walking away, finding better options, refusing to accept the old terms. Their quiet rebellion was helping to dismantle the system from within. But before the system fully collapsed, the millionaires made one final attempt at legitimacy. If they couldn't inherit aristocratic lineage, they would buy it. Or at least buy the cultural artifacts that suggested centuries of breeding. European masterpieces began crossing the Atlantic by the shipload, and the prices they paid would shock even the craftsmen who'd built their mansions. Chapter 7. European Envy and Art Collecting. American millionaires had a problem. They were richer than European aristocrats. Their houses were larger than European palaces. But nobody mistook them for nobility. They were new, raw, commercial. They made money in steel mills and oil refineries. European nobles inherited estates and titles going back centuries. The Americans wanted legitimacy, cultural legitimacy. They wanted to be seen as refined patrons, not just vulgar businessmen. So they turned to the one thing that could bridge the gap: acquiring masterpieces, old masters specifically, Renaissance paintings, medieval tapestries, ancient sculptures, the kind of cultural artifacts that came with centuries of provenance. If you couldn't inherit an aristocratic lineage, you could buy one, or at least buy the trappings that suggested one. The timing worked perfectly for both sides. European nobility had treasures but needed cash. American millionaires had cash but needed cultural credentials. A transatlantic market developed rapidly in the 1880s and 90s. British aristocrats sold first. The agricultural depression of the 1870s had devastated their rental incomes. Estates that had supported families for generations suddenly couldn't cover expenses. Paintings hanging in country houses for 200 years went to auction. American buyers scooped them up. J.P. Morgan led the way. The banker assembled one of the greatest private holdings in history. He bought entire estates, contents at once. Dealers would approach him with catalogs. Morgan would circle what he wanted, sometimes whole pages. The purchases would be crated and shipped to New York or his London residence. Morgan acquired everything: paintings, manuscripts, rare books, Chinese porcelain, Egyptian antiquities, medieval reliquaries, Renaissance bronzes. If it was old and valuable and culturally significant, Morgan wanted it. His holdings eventually filled multiple warehouses. Much of it he never even saw. He just owned it. Henry Clay Frick took a more focused approach. He wanted old master paintings exclusively: Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Velázquez. He built his mansion on Fifth Avenue specifically to display them properly. Large galleries, perfect lighting, climate control. The house was really a private museum that Frick happened to live in. Frick paid astonishing prices. In 1911, he bought a Rembrandt portrait for $500,000, equivalent to over $15 million today, for one canvas. He considered it a bargain. Great works only increased in value. And owning a Rembrandt meant something. It announced taste, sophistication, cultural authority. The Vanderbilts acquired pieces too, though less systematically than Morgan or Frick. They bought French furniture, Gobelin's tapestries, Italian Renaissance sculptures, whatever dealers convinced them they needed. Their mansions became museums of European decorative arts, imported wholesale and installed in American houses. William Randolph Hearst took acquiring to extremes. He bought entire European rooms, paneling ripped from French chateaux, ceilings from Italian palazzos. He'd have them disassembled, shipped to America, and reinstalled in his properties. If he liked a fireplace in a Spanish monastery, he'd buy the monastery. Take what he wanted, and leave the rest. The dealers who facilitated these transactions became wealthy themselves. Joseph Duveen dominated the trade. A British dealer with impeccable connections, he understood both sides perfectly. He knew which families needed money. He knew which American millionaires wanted prestige. He brought them together, taking substantial commissions. Duveen was also a master salesman. He convinced American patrons that certain artists mattered more than others. He promoted Rembrandt heavily, Dutch masters generally, Italian Renaissance works. He downplayed artists whose output was harder to sell. His influence shaped what American galleries looked like. The scale of the transatlantic transfer was enormous. Between 1870 and 1914, thousands of significant pieces left Europe for America. The Louvre and National Gallery lost nothing, but private estates were gutted. Works that had hung in English manor houses for centuries ended up in Fifth Avenue mansions. Europeans had mixed feelings. The sales brought needed capital, but they also represented cultural loss. National treasures leaving the country, heritage sold to American industrialists. Some criticized aristocrats for selling birthright for cash. But the aristocrats needed the money. Keeping the paintings meant losing the estate entirely. American museum directors also benefited. J.P. Morgan left much of his holdings to the Metropolitan Museum. Frick's entire house and contents became a museum after his death. Other wealthy patrons made similar arrangements. American institutions acquired European masterpieces without having to negotiate with foreign governments. But buying paintings didn't automatically confer sophistication. Critics, especially from abroad, mocked the Americans. They pointed out that purchasing culture wasn't the same as creating culture. The Americans were accumulating artifacts, not understanding them. They were buyers, not connoisseurs. Some criticism was accurate. American millionaires did purchase things without really understanding them. They relied on dealers, advice. They bought for status more than appreciation. A few were genuinely knowledgeable, but many simply wanted impressive galleries. Isabella Stewart Gardner was an exception. A Boston heiress, she built a Venetian palace in Boston specifically for her treasures. But unlike many wealthy patrons, she understood painting and sculpture deeply. She studied, she traveled extensively, she befriended artists and scholars. Her holdings reflected genuine passion, not just wealth. The competition between buyers drove prices higher. When multiple millionaires wanted the same Rembrandt, bidding could reach absurd levels. Dealers encouraged this. They'd hint that another patron was interested. They'd create artificial scarcity. The Americans, determined not to be outdone, paid whatever was asked. By the early 1900s, the best European masterpieces were increasingly in American hands. This represented a massive cultural shift. For centuries, great paintings had stayed in Europe. Now they were crossing the Atlantic in huge quantities. Museums worldwide noticed. American institutions were becoming major centers. The practice also created obligations. If you owned significant pieces, you were expected to share them eventually, through museum donations or by opening your home to scholars. The Gilded Age patrons largely accepted this. They saw themselves as stewards, not just owners. The canvases would outlast them. Their legacy would be making them accessible. But the First World War changed everything. Suddenly buying from Europe felt different. American soldiers were fighting there. The cultural exchange that had seemed sophisticated now felt complicated. Should Americans be purchasing treasures from countries they were defending militarily? After the war, the market continued. But the context had shifted. The American millionaires who'd built the great galleries were aging or dying. Their heirs often weren't interested in maintaining huge holdings. The assemblages began fragmenting. Museums acquired pieces. Some returned to Europe. The concentrated private galleries of the Gilded Age started dispersing. And the whole endeavor revealed something fundamental about Gilded Age wealth. These men could buy anything except the one thing they really wanted: legitimacy, cultural authority, the respect that comes from centuries of refinement. They could own Rembrandt, but they couldn't change the fact that their money came from oil wells and steel mills. They remained American businessmen who'd gotten very rich. The purchases couldn't transform them into something else. But the paintings could outlast them. The works they bought still hang in American museums. The holdings they assembled still benefit the public. Their money is gone. Their mansions are demolished. But the canvases remain. In that sense, they achieved a kind of immortality. Not the aristocratic legitimacy they sought, but perhaps something more valuable, a lasting contribution to American culture. But while the millionaires were purchasing European masterpieces to polish their image, another force was at work. Journalists with typewriters and determination. They weren't interested in what the wealthy wanted people to see. They were interested in what the wealthy wanted to hide, and they had the documents to prove it. Chapter 8. The Muckrakers Attack. The wealthy thought they controlled their image. They owned newspapers. They sponsored charities. They built libraries and museums with their names on them. They assumed public gratitude for their generosity. Then the journalists arrived and everything changed. The term muckraker came from Theodore Roosevelt. He borrowed it from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, referring to a character who raked muck instead of looking up to heaven. Roosevelt meant it as criticism. These journalists focused on society's filth rather than its progress. They exposed corruption instead of celebrating achievement. The muckrakers took it as a compliment. Yes, they raked muck, because American society had a lot of muck that needed raking. The movement began in the magazines. McClure's magazine led the way. Founded in 1893 by Samuel S. McClure, it published serious investigative journalism alongside fiction and general interest articles. McClure understood something crucial. Middle-class Americans wanted to understand the forces shaping their world. They sensed something was wrong with how wealth and power operated. They just needed someone to explain it clearly. In 1902, McClure's published 3 groundbreaking series simultaneously. Lincoln Steffens exposed urban political corruption in The Shame of the Cities. Ray Stannard Baker investigated labor conditions and racial inequality. And Ida Tarbell began her devastating series on Standard Oil. Tarbell's work hit hardest. She spent years researching John D. Rockefeller's business practices. She interviewed former Standard Oil employees. She obtained confidential documents. She traced the company's history from its founding through its rise to monopoly power. What she revealed shocked readers. Rockefeller hadn't built Standard Oil through superior products or service. He'd used ruthless tactics. Secret deals with railroads for preferential shipping rates. Predatory pricing to drive competitors bankrupt. Industrial espionage, bribery, threats. The company systematically destroyed anyone who challenged it. Tarbell wrote with precision and restraint. She didn't need sensationalism. The facts were damning enough. She showed how Rockefeller's monopoly raised prices for consumers while crushing small businesses. How the trust concentrated wealth while creating poverty. How one man's fortune came at immense cost to thousands of others. The series ran from 1902 to 1904. It was published as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, which became a bestseller. Suddenly, Rockefeller wasn't a captain of industry. He was a robber baron. His wealth wasn't admirable achievement. It was stolen goods. Rockefeller tried defending himself. He pointed to his philanthropy. The libraries, the universities, the medical research. Shouldn't his charitable work count for something? The public wasn't buying it. As one critic put it, Rockefeller was giving away with one hand what he'd stolen with the other. The philanthropy didn't erase the methods used to acquire the fortune. Blood money remained blood money, even when donated to good causes. Other muckrakers followed Tarbell's example. Upton Sinclair investigated the meatpacking industry. His novel, The Jungle, published in 1906, exposed horrific conditions in Chicago stockyards. Spoiled meat sold to consumers. Workers losing fingers in machinery. Rats falling into sausage grinders. The public was horrified. President Roosevelt, after reading it, invited Sinclair to the White House and ordered investigations. Sinclair had actually intended to highlight worker exploitation, the dangerous conditions, the poverty wages, the lack of rights. But readers fixated on the contaminated food. As Sinclair later said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." Still, the book achieved results. The Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act, both passed in 1906, came directly from The Jungle's impact. David Graham Phillips attacked political corruption. His series, The Treason of the Senate, published in 1906, showed how wealthy industrialists controlled senators through bribery and influence. The Senate was supposed to represent the people. Instead, it served corporate interests. Phillips named names, documented payments, showed the corruption mechanisms clearly. The attacks extended to specific industries and individuals. Thomas Lawson, a former stockbroker, wrote Frenzied Finance, exposing stock manipulation schemes. Charles Edward Russell investigated the Beef Trust. Ray Stannard Baker wrote about railroad monopolies. Every major industry came under scrutiny. The magazines that published these exposés saw circulation soar. McClure's reached hundreds of thousands of readers. Collier's Weekly, Everybody's Magazine, The American Magazine, all published muckraking journalism. They discovered that exposing corruption sold copies. Readers were hungry for this information. The wealthy fought back. They pressured advertisers to boycott muckraking magazines. They bought newspapers to counter the narratives. They hired public relations firms, a new industry, to improve their images. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., trying to rehabilitate his father's reputation, hired Ivy Lee, one of America's first PR professionals. Lee advised a softer approach. Show Rockefeller as human. Photograph him giving dimes to children. Emphasize his religious faith. Focus on philanthropy. Don't directly address the criticisms. Just flood the zone with positive stories until the negative ones faded. It partially worked. Rockefeller's image improved somewhat, but the fundamental damage remained. The muckrakers had shown that great fortunes were built on exploitation. The public couldn't unknow that. The investigations also led to concrete reforms. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, each addressed problems muckrakers had exposed. The journalism had real impact. It changed laws. It changed how Americans viewed wealth. For the Gilded Age elite, this was devastating. They'd assumed their wealth conferred authority, that their success proved they deserved power. The muckrakers challenged that assumption directly. They showed that wealth often came from exploitation, not talent. That monopoly power came from corruption, not efficiency. The psychological impact was significant. The wealthy had believed their own narratives. They genuinely thought they were benefactors, job creators, nation builders. The muckrakers reframed them as predators, thieves, oppressors. That reframing was hard to shake. Public opinion shifted dramatically. In 1880, most Americans admired wealthy industrialists. By 1910, many viewed them with suspicion or outright hostility. The change wasn't universal. Some still defended the robber barons. But the consensus had cracked. Wealth no longer automatically commanded respect. This made the social system harder to maintain. When Mrs. Astor threw elaborate balls, newspapers had once covered them admiringly. By the early 1900s, coverage turned critical. Why were the wealthy spending fortunes on parties when workers starved? The same actions that once seemed glamorous now seemed obscene. The muckrakers also inspired a generation. Young people read these exposés and decided to fight for reform. Future progressives, labor leaders, and politicians traced their awakening to muckraking journalism. The articles provided education. They showed how power actually worked. They revealed that change was possible. By 1912, the muckraking era was waning. Magazines faced economic pressure. Advertisers withdrew support. Some publications folded. Others toned down their criticism. The peak moment of exposure had passed. But the damage, from the wealthy's perspective, was permanent. The muckrakers had destroyed the moral authority of Gilded Age fortunes. They'd shown that wealth came from exploitation, that monopolies harmed the public, that the system was rigged. You couldn't go back from that knowledge. Once Americans understood how their society actually worked, They couldn't pretend otherwise. And that understanding created demand for change, real change, the kind that would eventually dismantle the Gilded Age entirely. The Muckrakers didn't destroy the Gilded Age alone, but they provided the intellectual ammunition. They gave reformers the facts they needed. They turned public opinion against unchecked wealth. They made continued excess politically impossible, and the wealthy never forgave them for it. But moral condemnation alone couldn't dismantle the mansions. That required something more concrete, something with the force of law, something that would bleed the fortunes faster than they could be replenished. In 1913, that force arrived, and it came with tax forms and ledgers that would prove more destructive than any journalist's pen. Chapter 9. Labor Revolts and the 1913 Tax. The workers had been patient, decades of patience, accepting poverty wages, enduring dangerous conditions, watching fortunes accumulate at the top while they struggled to feed their families. But patience has limits. By the 1890s, those limits had been reached. Across America, workers began fighting back, not with words, with strikes, work stoppages, confrontations that sometimes turned violent. The Gilded Age elite discovered that their wealth depended on workers who decided they'd had enough. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 set the pattern. It started in West Virginia, when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut wages. Workers walked off. The strike spread along rail lines to Maryland, then Pennsylvania, then across the country. Within weeks, tens of thousands of workers had stopped working. The railroads brought in strikebreakers. The strikers fought them. Violence erupted in multiple cities. In Pittsburgh, militiamen fired into crowds, killing 20. Rioters burned railroad property in response. Millions of dollars in damage. The strike lasted 45 days before federal troops restored order. The 1880s brought more conflicts. In 1886, the Haymarket Affair in Chicago shocked the nation. Workers were striking for an 8-hour workday. During a peaceful rally, someone threw a bomb at police. 7 officers died. Police opened fire on the crowd. 4 workers died. 8 anarchists were arrested and tried. 4 were hanged, though evidence connecting them to the bombing was thin. The Haymarket Affair terrified the wealthy. If workers were willing to use bombs, nowhere was safe. The Fifth Avenue mansions, the Newport cottages, the private railroad cars, all could be targets. Security increased. Guards were hired. Paranoia set in. The strikes continued. Steel workers, coal miners, textile workers. Virtually every major industry experienced labor unrest. The pattern was consistent. Workers demanded better wages or conditions. Management refused. Workers struck. Management brought in replacement workers. Violence often followed. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was particularly brutal. Andrew Carnegie's steel plant in Pennsylvania. Workers struck over wage cuts. Henry Clay Frick, managing the plant, hired 300 Pinkerton detectives as private security. The Pinkertons arrived by barge. Armed workers met them at the dock. A 12-hour gun battle followed. 10 died. Dozens were wounded. The state militia eventually broke the strike. The workers lost. The union was destroyed. But Carnegie's reputation suffered permanent damage. He had been in Scotland during the strike, claiming ignorance of Frick's tactics. Nobody believed him. The man who preached the gospel of wealth had ordered armed guards to shoot striking workers. The Pullman strike of 1894 showed labor's growing organization. When the Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages without reducing rents in company housing, workers struck. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, supported them by refusing to handle Pullman cars. The boycott paralyzed rail traffic nationwide. President Cleveland intervened. He sent federal troops to break the strike, claiming mail delivery was disrupted. Soldiers forced trains through. Debs was arrested. The strike collapsed. But it demonstrated that workers could organize across industries. That scared the wealthy more than isolated strikes ever had. Each strike brought the same response from management: refuse to negotiate, hire replacements, use violence if necessary. The wealthy saw compromise as weakness. If you gave in to one group of workers, others would make demands. Better to crush them all. But the strikes revealed something important. The Gilded Age depended on cheap labor. The mansions required dozens of underpaid servants. The factories needed workers willing to accept poverty wages. The railroads couldn't run without engineers and conductors working long hours for little pay. If those workers refused, the whole system stopped. This gave labor unexpected power, not enough to win most strikes. Management usually prevailed, but enough to make the wealthy nervous, enough to show that their control wasn't absolute, that their fortunes depended on continued cooperation from people they'd exploited. Public opinion was shifting too. Middle-class Americans who might once have sided with management began sympathizing with strikers. The Muckrakers' exposés had shown the exploitation. People understood why workers were angry. When militias shot striking workers, it looked like wealthy men using state power to protect profits. This created political pressure for reform. If violent strikes were the alternative, maybe modest concessions made sense. Progressive politicians began pushing labor reforms: limits on working hours, safety regulations, the right to organize unions. Nothing radical, but movement in labor's direction. The wealthy resisted all of it. They argued that business couldn't survive with regulations, that free markets required complete freedom, that workers were free to quit if they didn't like conditions. Government interference would destroy American prosperity. But they were losing the argument. Too many people had seen the alternative. Unrestricted capitalism had created obscene inequality. Workers weren't free to quit when quitting meant starvation. The market wasn't working for most Americans. Something had to change. The biggest change came in 1913. Congress passed the 16th Amendment, creating a federal income tax. For the first time, the government could tax wealth directly. The wealthy had fought this for decades. Previous attempts at income taxes had been struck down as unconstitutional. But the progressive movement finally forced it through. The amendment was ratified in February 1913. By October, the first income tax law was in effect. The initial rates were modest: 1% on income over $3,000, up to 7% on income over $500,000. The wealthy could afford it easily. But the principle terrified them. If the government could tax income, it could tax wealth. The power to tax was the power to destroy, and the rates would only rise. Within a few years, as World War I required massive government spending, top rates climbed dramatically. By 1918, the highest bracket paid 77%. The days of accumulating unlimited, untaxed wealth were over. The income tax changed the economics of everything. Building a mansion became less attractive when you couldn't keep as much of your earnings. Employing 50 servants made less sense when payroll wasn't deductible against lower net income. Throwing $100,000 parties felt wasteful when taxes claimed most of your profits. The wealthy adapted. They hired accountants to find deductions. They established trusts to shelter money. They moved assets offshore. Tax avoidance became an industry. But they couldn't avoid taxation entirely. The government was taking a cut. That was permanent. Inheritance taxes followed. The government taxed estates when wealth passed to heirs. This prevented fortunes from accumulating across generations. Each generation paid taxes. Over time, this eroded even the largest fortunes. The combination was devastating to Gilded Age economics. Labor unrest made businesses less profitable. Income taxes claimed much of what remained. Inheritance taxes prevented passing full fortunes to children. The system that had created massive wealth concentration was being dismantled piece by piece. By 1915, the landscape had shifted. Workers were organized. Strikes were common. Progressive reforms were passing. Taxes were climbing. The wealthy still had enormous resources, but the trajectory was clear. Their position was weakening. The Golden Age was ending. And then came the war. World War I would accelerate everything: the labor shortages, the taxes, the social changes. The conflict would reshape American society so thoroughly that the Gilded Age would never return. Even if the wealthy wanted to restore it, the world that had made it possible was gone. The war didn't just change economics. It shattered the ideological foundation that had justified the entire system. For decades, American millionaires had modeled themselves on European aristocracy. The mansions copied chateaux. The social rituals mimicked courts. The aspiration was to become American nobility. Then the trenches of Belgium and France revealed what aristocratic breeding was really worth. And the answer was nothing. Chapter 10. World War I shatters the illusion. August 1914. Europe erupted into war. Archduke Franz Ferdinand assassinated in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized. Germany invaded Belgium. France entered. Britain followed. Within weeks, the continent was engulfed in the largest conflict in human history. America stayed out. President Wilson declared neutrality. The war was Europe's problem. Let them fight. America would continue business as usual. But the conflict changed everything anyway. Even from across the Atlantic, World War I destroyed the world that had created the Gilded Age. And it did so in ways nobody anticipated. First, it killed European aristocracy, literally. Young British lords enlisted as officers and died in the trenches. French nobility lost sons at Verdun. German princes fell at the Somme. The officer class came disproportionately from aristocratic families. They led from the front. They died in enormous numbers. The statistics were staggering. Britain lost nearly 750,000 men, an entire generation. The peerage was devastated. Estates passed to distant relatives. Ancient family lines ended. The social structure that had survived centuries collapsed in 4 years. And that aristocracy had been the model American millionaires aspired to. The Fifth Avenue mansions were built to resemble European palaces. The elaborate social rituals mimicked European courts. American daughters married British lords to gain titles. The whole system depended on European aristocracy being worth imitating. Now that aristocracy was dying in Belgian mud. The sons of dukes lived in trenches infested with rats. Viscounts commanded men in gas attacks. Earls died anonymously in mass graves. The glamour, the romance, the centuries of refinement. None of it protected them from machine guns and artillery. American elites watched and absorbed the lesson. Titles meant nothing when shells were falling. Lineage didn't stop bullets. The European aristocracy they'd envied was revealed as vulnerable, mortal, not superior beings, just privileged people who happened to be born into the right families. The war also demonstrated that governments could do things previously considered impossible. Total mobilization, rationing, price controls, massive taxation, draft armies, command economies. The laissez-faire capitalism that had created Gilded Age fortunes was suspended. National survival required government control, and it worked. France, Britain, and eventually America reorganized their entire economies for military production. Governments directed labor, allocated resources, controlled prices. The invisible hand of the market was replaced by the visible hand of state planning. And societies didn't collapse. They adapted. This shattered ideological certainty. If governments could run economies during war, Why couldn't they regulate them during peace? If taxation could be increased dramatically to fund military spending, why couldn't it stay high to fund social programs? The war proved government intervention could work. That undermined every argument for unlimited capitalism. When America entered the conflict in April 1917, the changes accelerated. The government needed money. Income tax rates soared. The top bracket reached 77% by 1918. Revenue from income taxes increased from roughly $37 million in 1914 to nearly $1 billion in 1918. The government also needed labor. Women entered factories by the millions, taking jobs previously reserved for men. They proved they could do the work. They gained economic independence. They discovered they didn't need husbands or fathers controlling their income. When the war ended, many refused to return to previous subservience. This transformation affected domestic workers dramatically. Young women who'd been maids discovered they could earn more in munitions factories. The work was dangerous but paid better than service. And crucially, when the shift ended, they were done. They could go home, have privacy, live their own lives. After tasting that freedom, returning to being a servant felt intolerable. The shortage of household help accelerated quickly. Families who'd easily employed 30 or 40 people before the conflict struggled to find 10. Wages for domestic positions increased, but still couldn't compete with factory pay and freedom. The servant crisis that had been developing for years became acute. This made the mansions increasingly unlivable. A 50-room palace required substantial staff just for basic maintenance. Without that, the houses deteriorated, rooms went unused, standards declined. Families rattled around in enormous buildings they couldn't properly maintain. The conflict also changed American attitudes toward wealth display. When young men were dying in France, throwing elaborate parties felt obscene. The government encouraged restraint. Resources needed to go toward supporting troops. Conspicuous consumption seemed unpatriotic. The society continued, but subdued. Balls became smaller. Guest lists shortened. Menus simplified. Not from legal requirements, but from social pressure. Excess became embarrassing rather than impressive. The values that had driven Gilded Age competition, who could throw the most elaborate party, build the largest mansion, own the most extensive jewels, suddenly seemed trivial. The psychological shift was profound. A generation of young people came of age during the conflict. They saw aristocracy die. They saw governments control economies successfully. They saw women prove their capabilities. They saw wealth displays condemned as wasteful. When the fighting ended, they didn't want to return to the old system. They wanted something different. Veterans especially rejected pre-war values. They'd seen horrors, lost friends, witnessed industrial slaughter. Coming home to find wealthy families still living in palaces while workers struggled felt wrong. Many veterans became radicalized. Some joined labor movements. Others supported socialist candidates. They'd fought for democracy abroad and wanted it enforced at home. The Russian Revolution of 1917 terrified American elites. The Tsar overthrown, aristocracy murdered, property seized, communists in power. If it could happen in Russia, couldn't it happen here? The parallels were obvious. Extreme inequality, wealthy elites out of touch with common people. Workers pushed to breaking points. Russia had exploded. America might be next. This fear pushed some wealthy families toward modest reform. Better to accept higher taxes and some regulation than risk revolution. Better to tone down the ostentation than provoke the masses. Self-preservation required adaptation, but others reacted defensively. They blamed outside agitators. They claimed labor unrest was caused by communist infiltrators, not genuine grievances. They supported crackdowns on radicals. They fought every reform. This resistance would continue through the 1920s. But it was rearguard action. The momentum had shifted. The conflict also disrupted the transatlantic cultural flow. Americans had been buying European treasures for decades. The fighting made that impossible. European families had more urgent concerns than selling paintings. Art markets froze. Americans who'd been building collections found sources dried up. More importantly, the relationship changed. America had been the upstart, buying culture from refined Europe. But America emerged from the conflict as a creditor nation. European countries owed America billions. The power dynamic had reversed. Americans didn't need to feel inferior anymore. They'd saved Europe. That earned respect. When the armistice came in November 1918, America was transformed. Politically more progressive. Socially more egalitarian. Economically more regulated. Women had voted in some states and were pushing for national suffrage. Labor unions were stronger. Government was larger. Taxes were higher. The world of 1870, when Gilded Age fortunes began accumulating, was gone. The assumptions that supported unlimited wealth concentration had been shattered. Government could intervene in economies. Aristocracy wasn't inherently superior. Women could work and vote. Workers could organize. Extreme inequality was dangerous. The wealthy families who'd built Fifth Avenue palaces found themselves in a changed country. Their mansions seemed anachronistic. Their lifestyle seemed outdated. Their values seemed archaic. They could continue living as before, but only by ignoring reality. The foundation had cracked. The structure was unstable. And soon it would start coming down. The forces were all in place. Moral condemnation from the muckrakers. Economic pressure from income and inheritance taxes. Social transformation from the war. Labor shortages that made the mansions unlivable. What remained was the mathematics. The cold, brutal arithmetic that would prove these palaces could no longer function as private homes. And that arithmetic was about to become undeniable. Chapter 11. When the heirs couldn't afford it. Cornelius Vanderbilt III inherited his grandfather's mansion in 1926. He didn't want it. The house at 5th Avenue and 57th Street was magnificent. 130 rooms. An entire city block. The largest private residence in Manhattan. It had cost over $3 million to build in 1882. It represented the peak of Gilded Age ambition. It also cost $30,000 annually in property taxes alone. Add heating, electricity, basic maintenance, and insurance. Carrying costs exceeded $100,000 yearly. To actually live there meant employing at least 30 staff members. That added another $100,000 or more in wages. Cornelius III was wealthy by any normal standard, but he couldn't afford that house. Nobody could, not anymore. The economics had fundamentally changed. His grandfather, Cornelius II, had lived during an era of no income tax. Every dollar earned was kept. Accumulating wealth was straightforward. Make money, keep money, buy property. By 1926, the top income tax bracket was 25%. It had been 77% during the recent conflict and would rise again. But even at 25%, it meant giving a quarter of your income to the government before paying any other expenses. Inheritance taxes compounded the problem. When Cornelius II died, his fortune passed with minimal taxation. By the 1920s, estate taxes claimed significant portions of inherited wealth. The money that funded the mansion's construction couldn't be replicated by heirs facing modern taxation. The servant situation was equally impossible. Before the conflict, finding qualified household help was easy. Young immigrants needed work. Domestic positions, while poorly paid, offered employment. But after the conflict, opportunities had expanded. Factories paid better. Retail positions offered more freedom. Fewer people were willing to work as live-in help. Those still willing to serve demanded higher wages. The imbalance of supply and demand worked in their favor. If you wanted a butler, a housekeeper, and adequate staff, you paid premium rates and still struggled to fill positions. The mathematics didn't work. To maintain a Fifth Avenue palace required perhaps $250,000 annually. To generate that after taxes required earning considerably more. You needed an enormous fortune producing substantial income. And even then, most of that fortune would go toward maintaining one house. Cornelius III looked at the numbers and made a rational decision. Sell. The house went to Bergdorf Goodman for $7 million. They wanted the land, not the building. Within months, the mansion was demolished. He wasn't alone. Up and down Fifth Avenue, similar calculations were happening. Andrew Carnegie's widow sold his mansion in 1926. The house was barely 27 years old. It had been built to last centuries. It lasted less than 3 decades. The Astor mansions came down. The Havemeyer house was demolished. The Senator Clark Palace, which had cost $7 million and taken 7 years to build, was torn down in 1927. One by one, the monuments to Gilded Age excess disappeared. The families selling weren't broke. Many remained wealthy. But wealth wasn't enough. You needed extraordinary resources to maintain these palaces. And increasingly, the resources required exceeded what even wealthy families could justify spending. Some tried adapting. They closed off floors, lived in just a few rooms, reduced staff to bare minimums. But living in a 50-room mansion with 5 staff members meant the house deteriorated. Rooms went unheated. Leaks weren't repaired. Standards declined. The buildings required full staffing, or they fell apart. Others tried converting mansions to other uses, turned them into apartments, offices, clubs. But the buildings weren't designed for conversion. The rooms were too large. The layouts too specific. Electrical and plumbing systems were outdated. Converting cost more than demolishing and building new. The land values made demolition inevitable anyway. A Fifth Avenue lot was worth millions, but only if you could build something profitable on it. A mansion housing one family generated no income. An apartment building housing dozens of families, or a commercial building with shops and offices, generated substantial revenue. The financial logic was overwhelming. Sell the land, demolish the mansion, build something modern. Developers paid premium prices because they knew they could make money. The families accepted because keeping the houses meant slowly going broke. The emotional cost was significant. These weren't just buildings. They were family homes. Places where children had grown up, where weddings had happened, where parents and grandparents had lived. Selling meant admitting that era was over, that the family's glory days had passed. Some descendants fought to keep houses. They borrowed money, deferred maintenance, struggled on, but most eventually surrendered. The economics were inescapable. You couldn't maintain Gilded Age mansions on post-Gilded Age incomes. The demolitions happened quickly once they started. Wrecking crews could tear down a mansion in weeks. The limestone facades that had taken years to carve were smashed to rubble. The ornate interiors were gutted. Some architectural elements were saved and sold to collectors or museums. Most went to landfills. Photographs from the era show the surreal sight of these palaces being destroyed. Walls knocked down, roofs collapsed, elegant facades with gaping holes. The contrast between the buildings' grandeur and their violent demolition was stark. What took years to build took days to destroy. New York wasn't alone. Similar patterns played out in other cities. The Chicago mansions came down. The Philadelphia estates were sold. Newport's cottages fared slightly better because they were vacation homes, not year-round residences. But even there, many were demolished or fell into neglect. The speed of the transformation shocked observers. In 1890, Fifth Avenue was lined with mansions. By 1930, most were gone, 40 years from construction to demolition. Buildings designed to last centuries didn't survive half that. What replaced them told its own story. Department stores, office buildings, apartment houses, commercial enterprises open to anyone with money to spend. The exclusive residential district became mixed use. Public access replaced private privilege. The physical landscape reflected changed social values. A few mansions survived. Henry Clay Frick's house became a museum as he'd planned. His widow lived there until 1931. Then the Frick collection opened to the public. It remains today one of the world's great small museums. Andrew Carnegie's mansion survived longer than most before finally being demolished in 1940. By then, it had been unused for over a decade. Nobody wanted to buy it, nobody could maintain it. Eventually, the land was too valuable to leave vacant. The survivors were exceptions. The Cooper Hewitt Museum now occupies Andrew Carnegie's former mansion on 91st Street, a different Carnegie house that was converted rather than demolished. The Museum of the City of New York occupies what was once a mansion. A handful of others became clubs or institutions, but the vast majority are gone. Where the Vanderbilt mansion stood is now Bergdorf Goodman. Where the Astor houses were is now commercial real estate. The physical evidence of the Gilded Age mostly disappeared. The buildings that announced wealth so loudly were silenced. The demolitions represented more than architectural loss. They marked the end of an economic system, the end of a social structure, the end of an era when unlimited wealth accumulation was possible and maintaining private palaces was feasible. The heirs weren't failures. They simply lived in different times, times with higher taxes, higher costs, different values. Times when spending $250,000 annually on one house seemed wasteful rather than admirable. Times when economic realities made such spending impossible even for the wealthy. The Gilded Age had built its monuments, and then economic and social changes made those monuments unsustainable. The mansions came down not because of disaster or deliberate destruction, but because nobody could afford to keep them standing. But a few did survive. And their survival came with a condition. They had to transform from private fortresses into public institutions. The palaces that outlasted their builders did so by opening their doors to everyone. And in that transformation lies perhaps the only redemption this story offers. The 1920s and 30s transformed Fifth Avenue beyond recognition. Where French chateaux had stood, Art Deco towers rose. Where private palaces had occupied entire blocks, apartment buildings housed hundreds of families. The street that had symbolized Gilded Age excess became a commercial thoroughfare. The architectural style of what replaced the mansions tells its own story. Art Deco is modern, clean lines, geometric patterns, no historical pretense. These buildings didn't try to look like European palaces. They announced themselves as thoroughly American and contemporary, the future, not the past. Bergdorf Goodman's new building on the Vanderbilt site opened in 1928. Elegant but commercial, anyone with money could enter. No social credentials required, no calling cards, no introductions, just walk in and shop. The democratization was complete. Where society's 400 once gathered, thousands now browsed. The apartments that replaced other mansions followed similar patterns. Buildings like 740 Park Avenue, completed in 1930, housed wealthy families. But instead of one family per block, dozens lived in the same building. They shared an address, shared lobbies, shared staff. The extreme isolation of the Gilded Age mansion was gone. These apartments were luxurious. Large rooms, high ceilings, fine details. But they were still apartments. You didn't employ 30 personal staff. The building provided doormen, maintenance, cleaning. Services were professionalized and shared. More efficient, less wasteful, more suited to the times. The economic logic was inescapable. An apartment building generated income for owners while providing housing efficiency for residents. The land was used productively. Taxes could be covered by rental income. The buildings sustained themselves financially in ways single-family mansions never could. But not everything was demolished. A few Gilded Age structures survived by transforming their purpose. They became museums, clubs, schools, or cultural institutions. Survival required public access. Private palaces became public resources. The Frick Collection opened in 1935. Henry Clay Frick had planned this. His mansion was designed to eventually house his art. When his widow died in 1931, the house and collection transferred to a trust. Renovations adapted the building for museum use. It opened to visitors who once would never have been admitted. Walking through the Frick today feels like visiting a Gilded Age mansion frozen in time. The paintings Frick collected still hang. The furniture remains. The rooms are arranged much as they were when he lived there. Except now anyone can visit. Pay admission and you enter a world that was once completely private. The Morgan Library followed a similar path. J.P. Morgan's personal library became a museum after his son donated it to the public in 1924. The building was expanded but retained its original character. The rare books, manuscripts, and artworks Morgan collected are now available to scholars and visitors. These institutions preserve not just buildings but entire collections. The art the robber barons accumulated didn't vanish. It was made accessible. In an ironic way, their fortunes ended up serving the public good they'd often ignored while alive. Other mansions became clubs. The University Club, the Metropolitan Club. Private organizations bought the buildings and adapted them. Members, rather than single families, now use the grand rooms. Still exclusive, but serving broader purposes than one household. Some became schools or cultural centers. The building that now houses the Museum of the City of New York started as a private residence. The Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum occupies Andrew Carnegie's mansion on 91st Street. The buildings found new life by serving educational purposes. But these survivors were exceptions. For every mansion that was repurposed, 10 were demolished. The majority of Gilded Age architecture simply vanished. Block after block that had been residential became commercial. The physical transformation mirrored the social one. Newport's preservation happened differently. The Rhode Island cottages survived because they were vacation homes, not primary residences. The carrying costs, while substantial, were manageable for wealthy families who used them seasonally. And eventually, many were donated to the Preservation Society of Newport County. Today, tourists visit the Breakers, Marble House, and other Newport mansions. They walk through rooms that once hosted society balls. They see the opulence firsthand. The houses function as museums, teaching visitors about an era that ended a century ago. The demolished mansions left almost nothing behind. Some architectural elements were saved. Doors, mantels, paneling. They ended up in museums or other buildings, but the structures themselves vanished completely. In many cases, even photographs are scarce. The buildings existed for such short periods that documentation is limited. This erasure was remarkably thorough. A visitor to Fifth Avenue today sees almost no evidence of the Gilded Age. The buildings are gone. The families who built them are footnotes in history. The social system that sustained it all has vanished. Only the stories remain. The Art Deco buildings that replaced the mansions are themselves now historic. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center. These structures from the 1920s and 30s define New York's skyline. They represent a different set of values. corporate power rather than individual wealth, modernism rather than historical imitation, commerce rather than exclusivity. In a sense, the replacement buildings are more democratic. Thousands of people work in an office tower. One family lived in a mansion. The land serves more people, the architecture is more efficient, the social impact is broader. By those measures, the change was progress. But something was lost, too. The craftsmanship. The materials. The sheer ambition of building a private palace in a modern city. The Gilded Age mansions were excessive, wasteful, monuments to inequality. They were also artistic achievements. The labor and skill that went into them can't be replicated. Modern economics makes such buildings impossible. Even billionaires today don't build 100-room urban palaces. Costs are too high. Staff is unavailable. Taxes are prohibitive. The social climate condemns such display. The combination of economic and cultural factors that made Gilded Age mansions possible no longer exists. So what we're left with are the exceptions. The Frick, the Morgan Library, the Newport cottages, windows into a vanished world, carefully preserved examples of an era that ended a century ago. They let us see how the wealthy once lived, and they remind us that nothing, no matter how solid it seems, is permanent. The Gilded Age built its monuments. Then, economic forces, social changes, and shifting values destroyed most of them. The wrecking balls that demolished Vanderbilt mansions in the 1920s demolished more than buildings. They demolished a social system, an economic structure, a way of life that had seemed unshakable but proved remarkably fragile. What survived did so by transforming, by opening to the public, by serving broader purposes. The private palaces that became public institutions endured. The ones that remained exclusively private vanished. That might be the final lesson. Wealth that serves only itself doesn't last. Fortunes that benefit only their owners get dispersed. Buildings that house only one family get demolished. But resources dedicated to public benefit can endure. The art collections, the libraries, the museums. These legacies outlasted the fortunes that created them. The Gilded Age ended. Its mansions fell. Its social system collapsed. But transformed into institutions serving everyone, some of what it created survives. Not as monuments to wealth, but as resources for learning. Not as private luxury, but as shared heritage. The age ended. But pieces of it, repurposed and democratized, remain.